Hi, everybody, and welcome back to a new episode of the Accidental Expat Life. I'm Doug, and today I'm going to be talking about my third and final English teaching job in South Korea. I was currently working in an area called Nowon, which was in the northern part of Seoul, at a school that was teaching elementary and high school students in a classroom setting. We had classes of about 15 to 20 students. For the most part, it was quite good, but there were times when it was a challenge, when you had some behavior problems. You had some students who really didn't want to be there. Their parents were forcing them to go. It was after their regular school days, so they were usually quite tired or just on edge, and it became a bit of a challenge. So I enjoyed it, but it was kind of getting to a point where I was almost having enough. At that point, I really didn't know what my plans were going to be, whether I was going to stay in Korea, whether I was going to return back to Canada and get back into the golf business. So I didn't know what I was doing. I wasn't actively looking for a new job. But one day I was on the subway going into Seoul, and I saw an ad that was obviously aimed at potential students, but it was all in Korean, but judging by the photo, it was showing one teacher and one student. And I thought that looked kind of like an interesting concept. And I noticed there were probably about, 10 or so locations throughout Seoul. So I thought I would stop by at one just to find out a little bit more information and ask what the chances were with regards to working there. So they gave me some information, and I decided to come back in a couple of days for an interview. Now, I ended up getting hired, and the location that they had available was in Gangnam. Now, if any of you are familiar with the song Gangnam Style from a few years ago, this is the area that the song was based on. Now, Gangnam is probably one of the most expensive areas in Seoul. A lot of expensive stores, all the big brand names, expensive restaurants, bars. So it was really a great area to be in. If that's where if you ever go to Seoul, that is the area that you want to go to, because that's where everything is happening. And it was something that I was really excited about. Now, the school itself was, as I said, judging by the photo that I saw on the subway, was a school that taught one-on-one or 1-on-4. There were no groups that were larger than 4. So it was more of a private tutoring kind of a setting. So you had your own private little office, and you saw your students in a one-on-one setting, which I had a couple of groups, but for the most part it was one-to-one. Now, I had a wide variety of students while I worked there, and it was really, really cool. I had some older secondary students who were getting ready to go maybe to university in either Europe or North America, somewhere where they needed to speak English. I had some business professionals who their companies were sending there to improve their English because they did business abroad, so they needed them to speak better English. I had a few actors and actresses, which was really, really interesting. I also had the general manager of one of the Korean professional baseball teams. So that was for me, being a real sports nut, that was very interesting. He was able to get me some tickets to some games, and I thought that was great. I had a few housewives who, during the day, didn't have anything to do other than be around the house, so they wanted to improve their English as well. So it was a wide variety of students that I had while I worked there, and it was a really, really great job. So as I mentioned, some of the advantages of it were there were no big classes, which meant no behavior problems, no issues. 80% of my students were adults. And the best part about it, it was mainly dealing with conversation English. So it was just talking about things that they wanted to talk about. We did have books that we worked from that would help, but for the most part, it was things that they wanted to talk about. So it was very, very easy. Now, some of the disadvantages of it are probably, I shouldn't say disadvantages, plural. I think the main disadvantage for me working at that location was the manager that I worked for really didn't understand that during the course of the day, you needed a break, either for lunch or for dinner or to go to the washroom or anything like that, just something to recharge throughout the course of the day. Now, there were days where maybe you didn't have many appointments, but there were a number of days where I was booked from the start until the end, and I didn't have a break. The classes were, I think, 50 minutes long, so you had about 10 minutes between classes to get ready for your next student. But you didn't have a chance to eat. And there were a few times where that happened to me, and I was getting a little bit angry because, you couldn't function properly without having a meal of some sort. So we got into a little bit of a disagreement about that, which they said, oh, unfortunately, there's nothing we can do because the student wants to come in and that is the time that they want to come in at, so we have to book them. So I could understand that to one point, but for the most part, you got to give the teacher at least one break in there at some point, and they weren't doing that. So that got me a little bit frustrated. So while I was there, about halfway through the year, I had 2 weeks off, and since golf was so expensive in Korea, I was itching to play golf. I was only going to the driving range, and it was not a lot of fun. So I decided to book a golf trip down to Thailand for a couple of weeks, and did a lot of research on it, a lot of great courses. Obviously, the weather was terrific, so it was something that was very interesting for me. And I booked the flight, booked my accommodations, booked my reservations at the golf course, and headed down there. And not knowing what was lying ahead, it turned out to be a trip that ended up changing my life. And it was something that put me on this path of being the accidental expat, because it wasn't something that I planned on doing when I first moved from Canada to go to Korea. So it was something that changed my life. And in the next episode, I'm going to talk about what happened on that trip that ended up getting me to move to Thailand. So we'll see you on the next one. Hope you enjoyed this, and we'll see you soon.